Good afternoon here in DC. My name is Andrew Mertha, and I'm the George and Sadie Hyman Professor of China Studies and the Director of the SAIS China Global Research Center. I'm so glad that you could join us today. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to take care of some housekeeping. Please do send questions in the Q&A as soon as you have them so that I can organize them and we can have a more robust Q&A session. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank my wonderful colleagues, Ellie Rustum, Amanda Nepomuceno, Hasta Coleman, Sean Lynette, Jessica Moreno, Mo Alahi, and everybody else for their hard work in making today's event possible. This is the third in our China methodology series, Relearning the Lost Arts of China Scholarship, which has featured Professor Frederick Tevis, Professors Joe Fewsmith, and Dr. Alice Miller. The goal of this series is to learn from our senior colleagues who have distinguished themselves by, among many other things, writing cogently and presciently about China in an era of little to no access, so that those of us who had taken that access for granted might learn to maintain our scholarship in this new era of limited direct access to people and data in China. We're joined today by another titan in the China field, not simply because of his uniformly excellent and provocative China scholarship, but also because of his long-standing work in the policy arena. Dr. Thomas Fingar most certainly walks on two legs, both equally strong in the academy and in government. He is the Shorenstein Distinguished Fellow in the Shorenstein's Asia Pacific Research Center at Stanford University. From May 2005 through December of 2008, he served as the first Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Analysis and concurrently as Chairman of the National Intelligence Council. Previous positions include Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research from 2000 to 2001 and 2004 to 2005, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary from 2001 to 2003, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Analysis, 1994 to 2000, Director of the Office of Analysis for East Asia and the Pacific, and Chief of the China Division. Dr. Fingar is a graduate of Cornell University and Stanford, Cornell for his undergraduate work and Stanford for his master's and PhD degrees, both in political science. His most recent books are Uneasy Partnerships, China's Engagement with Japan, the Koreas, and Russia in an Era of Reform, of which he's the editor and has contributed a number of the chapters. The New Great Game, China's Relations with South and Central Asia in the Era of Reform, and Reducing Uncertainty, Intelligence Analysis, and National Security, all at Stanford University Press, and the edited volume Fateful Decisions, co-edited with Jean Oy. They are must-reads, and I hope that all of you, if you don't have them on your bookshelves, you will soon. We most recently crossed paths when I was invited to participate in a conference and to subsequently submit a paper that eventually became the edited volume by my colleague and friend, Ann Thurston, Engaging China. One of the themes that I explored was how scholars and students at the time of the Vietnam War were motivated to learn about the region in order to prevent future tragedies like the war in Vietnam. I can think of no better endorsement to country-specific scholarship than that. On a personal note, Dr. Fingar once told me that one reason he opted to focus on China was because the China studies community was extremely friendly and congenial to one another. This sense of genuine collegiality and collaboration is something that I too have found in the China studies community. And nobody exemplifies that more than Dr. Fingar. And I'm delighted to welcome him and to pass over the microphone to him. Tom?
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for the generous introduction, for plugging my books, and for the opportunity to speak in this important series. I commend you and all at the China program at SAIS who have conceived and put it together. I was quite flattered to be asked to talk about old tools in our methodological toolkit. I felt less flattered when I realized that the primary qualification for the invitation was that I have a lot of gray hair. That previous talks by Fred Tewis, Alice Miller, Joe Fewsmith describe some of the sources available to us and how we use them. I'm going to build upon what they have said by providing context. In some ways, this talk is the prequel to their discussions of specifics. What I want to do is shift the focus from how we studied China to what we sought to understand and why we focused on the questions that we did. I need to underscore the point that how we studied China was a function of what we wanted to know and why we wanted to know it. It was not simply a matter of what do you do when you don't have access? What sources do you use when there is no literature? How do you substitute for spending time in a factory or a village or a military unit when even contemplation of doing that kind of research is beyond the pale? Our work back in for me, it begins in the late 60s, but also in the 1970s, was driven mainly by, in quotes, big questions. And the big questions were about China, not a part of China, not a subsystem or a sector or an economic class or a particular military unit. We did the whole ball of wax. That was the unit of analysis, which, reflecting on that after 50 years, seems almost crazy. It's a huge place. It's a diverse place. It's got lots of people. It's got lots of different components. And how could we be so arrogant as to believe that we could study China in its entirety? What I want to do in the next several minutes is talk a little bit about why we did that and why we didn't focus on more manageable, bite-sized, subnational topics, why we didn't even think about doing big N studies using lots of data to discover hidden relationships and causality, and why we didn't study what one might refer to as interesting but esoteric puzzles. So rediscovering lost skills isn't just about learning to peer over the wall and how to imagine what's occurring inside black boxes inside a country that we couldn't even contemplate visiting. To dust off or sharpen up old techniques really only makes sense if they help to address the questions of today and tomorrow. That as our field, and I do hope to be active for a while longer, as our field rethinks our approach to the study of China, while hoping that access is going to improve again soon, but we need to orient our thinking to the concerns and the questions of today and to the disciplinary expectations and requirements, the customers who may be interested in our work inside and outside of government and so forth. That it would be inappropriate to try to transplant the conditions, the shaping factors, the drivers of the 1960s and 70s into the 21st century. But I think it's important to review the way in which what we did was shaped by the nascent China field as it was taking shape, by the relationship to China policy, government interest, the relationship to disciplinary evolution. And as always, when talking to academics, the job market, what the impact might be on a career. So what I'm going to do now is talk about what we were trying to do and how that shaped our approaches. I don't think our questions and our approaches were necessarily better. They were different, and they were tailored to meet a particular set of objectives. Purpose shaped our goals. Our goals or objectives shaped the questions that we explored. The questions shaped our approach to getting answers to those questions. And that shaped the choice of tools and techniques at least as much as the availability or non-availability of certain kinds of information. Indeed, I don't remember one time in which I felt stymied because particular types of information were not readily available. The dynamic or the direction of research methodology, designing the methodology, started with what do we want to know? And what do we want to know was shaped by what do we want to understand? And that was shaped by why do we care? Why do we want to understand? What's the purpose of this scholarship? There wasn't, back in the days of yore, a lot of idea that we would do research on questions that were simply curiosities, just because they were interesting. It was much more purposive, and I will try in this period to explain what those purposes were and what shaped them. To make obvious an implicit point from what I just said, we did very little micro research. We couldn't. But we also didn't do micro research because it wasn't desired and it wasn't rewarded. Even if we could get access to a particular trove of documents or a particular set of refugees in Hong Kong, or a particular point of access by working at a distance with a citizen of a country that had relations with China and could be on the ground for a while. But there wasn't a burning desire on our part or on the part of the departments that evaluated our work, the presses that published or didn't our writings, or in important respects, the government agencies that turned to us for information and insight. Our goals, our questions, our approaches, the techniques were shaped by a particular and no longer extant set of circumstances. I'm going to talk through some of those circumstances, not simply because I think it's useful to understand history, but because I hope they will trigger thinking about contemporary analogs, or the way in which factors, conditions have evolved over time. That in broad compass, the factors, the considerations that I will talk about exist mutatis mutandi. They don't translate directly into the current era, but they rhyme. So as the Long Ranger used to say, before most of you were born, return with me now to the thrilling days of yesteryear. And we'll talk about what we studied and why we studied it. The questions asked about China, or almost any other place or problem or puzzle, are triggered and shaped by what one wants to know, and or what access and sources allow. The two broad approaches are to begin with a trove of material. I did that in the mid-1960s in a master's program when documents on the American response to the Mexican Revolution were opened up after a 50-year period. And it was exciting to be the first people in 50 years to go in and work with these documents. So that determined the kind of questions we explored. The other way is to begin with the question, to begin with what you want to know. And 50 years later, it's actually quite difficult to imagine how little we knew then, and how important we thought it was to build basic knowledge and to inform government policy. It's not quite accurate to say we were on a mission to build the field of China studies and to utilize the fruits of our research to shape government policy, but that surely was an element of it. And Andy Mertha mentioned that in the beginning, that my age cohort, those of us who began studying Asia in the 60s, did have a shared and strong determination that our research should not be used to justify mistaken military operations, but that it should be used to avoid conflict and build sustainable, mutually beneficial relationships with people on the other side of the Pacific. So 50 years ago, the nascent field of China studies and its aspiring specialists were products of and shaped by conditions and concerns of the time. And a concern and focus of rapidly evolving social science disciplines, insights from our teachers, then as now by academic fads, and also by what was required to, in quote, succeed as a China specialist. We wanted jobs then, as people want jobs now, but we also wanted jobs that mattered. For us, this was having an impact on the actions of the United States. What I'm going to try and do is clarify and illustrate what I mean by this. But first, I need to locate this discussion in time. When I began to study China seriously in 1965, that's before the Cultural Revolution. It's 20 years after World War II. Scholarship was beginning to be plentiful and influential on lessons learned from the experience of World War II, documentary troves captured in Germany, in Italy, and in Japan. It was 15 years after the establishment of the People's Republic of China. It's a decade after the worst of McCarthyism. And it's right at the point where the Vietnam War is beginning to ramp up, both in the magnitude of the conflict and the anxiety and anger within the American body politic about that war, and it's particularly within the academic community. So all of these factors came into play. Another element at the time is there was virtually no literature on China. In the first course that I took on China's political system, the only textbook-like reading was John Lewis's Leadership in Communist China. A year or so later, Schumann's Ideology and Organization came out. But we read a lot of Mao's writings, military writings, political writings, because they were available. We read history. What was imperial China like? There wasn't much written about Republican China at that point. That we were very much groping for anything that would help us to understand this big, complex, and increasingly important international actor. Policymaker and intellectual concerns shaped the way we thought about China. I mentioned the legacy of World War II. We're also in the early stages of the Cold War. So disciplines and what became known as area studies were looking backward for lessons and forward for predictions or preparing to deal with new nations, new systems, with a bipolar world. So the lessons about World War II, about ideology, the uses of propaganda, the uses of coercion, were very much on the minds of the people who taught us, studying authoritarian regimes. Cold War dynamics that included the non-aligned movement, but ideology, alignment with or against the Soviet Union and the United States. Where was China on that spectrum? It had aligned with the Soviet Union in 1950. By 1960, it was perfectly clear that the break with the Soviets was real. China claimed to be both a socialist country and a non-aligned country. What did that mean? Exactly. What did it mean to be non-aligned in a bipolar world? These questions and many similar ones kind of motivated interests far beyond the China field. In part because this was also an era of new nations, of nation building, of area studies. Why was that the case? The number of countries in the world doubled between 1950 and 1965. If you wanted to study West Africa up until the late 60s, you went to Paris or London or Lisbon. Suddenly, we had to know a lot more about a lot of places. China was an old nation, but the PRC was a new country. And the new country of China seemed to be repurposing some old institutions while it was building new ones. So the questions that government agencies, academic departments were asking about new nations in general, what makes them stable or not, what's required for them to be successful economically, to build a particular type of political system, to build a single identity out of multiple linguistic and tribal groups. All of these general area studies questions were absolutely apt for the study of China. And as the field of, or the approach of area studies developed, it was in the context of evolving and emerging social science disciplines. This was a period in which there was a great quest for greater scientific rigor. It was also the period of the behavioral revolution in the social sciences. The widespread effort to apply structural functional approaches to studying other countries and systems. What were the institutions used to perform sets of activities that were thought to be common and necessary in all systems, all economic systems, all political systems, all social systems? Which ones were unique to a particular place? Could the ones that were unique prove more viable than ones that were common? We looked at things like interest groups, leaders and elites, group behavior, dependency theory, political economy, as approaches to understand developments in our social science discipline. And these approaches were applied to China. Some of them were more useful than others. I can remember as a grad student, everybody had to learn about voter behavior and analysis of voter behavior. I did the Soviet Union and China. I didn't do very well in the courses that taught me about analyzing voter behavior and public opinion in the two big communist countries that I was trying to study. But many, many other of the foci and tools developed in the disciplines, and that we had to learn in order to succeed within the disciplinary specialty, became a part of our toolkit for approaching China. Some of these approaches and techniques have withered away with time. Some turned out to be not particularly useful. Some played out because they'd answered the questions they were designed to, and other questions had replaced them. But I'm reminded of a conversation with Gabriel Allman, one of the founding fathers of the behavioral revolution in political science. He was 92 at the time of this conversation, and he talked about the reputation, the fame that he and a small group of others, Sid Verber, Lucian Pai, sort of acquired because of a panel that they had organized at an American Political Science Association meeting, that they were speculating about the way politics worked, and it was very well received, and they went to their head and they wrote a number of books. Well, going back 60 years later, he said, at the time I thought politics was like a clock. And if I studied how the gears mesh, I would understand how it works. He says, now I understand that politics is like a cloud. It forms and it drifts and it reforms and it responds to the wind. His point was that the mental models that we bring to bear really do shape what we find at the end of the research process, as well as the way in which we undertake. So we need to ask ourselves, what are the mental models we have of China today? This was also a period of very primitive use of computers. The expression garbage in, garbage out dates from this period. But it was we counted all kinds of stuff. And we tried to correlate things that we could count. And we did content analysis of Chinese and other documents in order to find deep meaning, true meaning, messages to be communicated, drawing upon the study of propaganda from the Second World War. We did a lot of silly things, or the field did a lot of silly things. I remember a study that sort of used everything that was counted already. It wasn't generating new data, it was taking data that was available. And it counted things like number of weekly air flights and size of embassy staffs and trade flows. And it produced the absolutely definitive judgment that on the basis of all of these numbers, that had been crunched by the computer, the United States considered the Soviet Union to be 2.8 times as important as Ghana. That was an interesting finding. I have no idea what it meant, and nobody else did either. But for a while, it was very faddish to do that kind of work and to wish we could do it on China if only we had reliable numbers about something. So we tried to work with some unreliable numbers. Each of these strands of analysis, influenced by Cold War study of totalitarianism, by studies of revolution that were going on at the time, area studies, disciplinary, were tied together in a few respects that I'll cite here. One is government interest. Area studies, the new nations, nation building, requisites for aid programs, lining up support in United Nations organizations, building military alliances, capabilities, seeking basing. There were a lot of activities going on in this period, and the federal government realized it didn't know nearly as much as it needed to know about much of the world, certainly to include China. And the federal government, beginning in the Eisenhower administration, began to put money into area studies. Federal funding of the National Defense Education Act, language study, libraries, and area studies centers. Those of you in Washington may not appreciate the viewpoint from outside the Beltway. But having been at Stanford in the 1960s, when some genius in Washington decided that Stanford and Berkeley were both in the Bay Area and therefore close, so we should have a joint center to study East Asia. Even then, distance in this part of the country is measured in minutes, not miles. And Berkeley was too far from Stanford to do much together. But the point was, there was abundant federal funding for baseline research that would help us to get the tools to study different parts of the world, including China. As the federal government began to back off foundations, notably Ford, but others, poured money into research capabilities for policy-relevant Asian area studies. The tradition or the goal of policy relevance continued after the primary funding moved from government into the foundation world. There wasn't a lot of room for esoterica. This was to generate research that could be used, that could provide immediately useful insights, not building block knowledge to develop the field and train future students. But each of these strands of intellectual interest were reflected in university departments. What was taught, the criteria used to evaluate thesis and other work, used to evaluate those who were seeking a job, including jobs in China studies. And I confess that in the late 60s and 70s, we didn't worry much about getting a job. That the number of jobs in the exploding field of area studies exceeded the number of new PhDs coming out of the pipeline. So we were going to get jobs without many of the competitive pressures, publishing pressures, and so forth, on that apply today. That was important because there wasn't the same sense of competition. We're all going to find jobs. So working together was not tempered by, if I share my findings with her, she might be a better candidate for the job than I will be. It simply didn't come into play at the time. Andy mentioned in the opening remarks the collegiality within the China field. And so I started out doing know your enemy stuff, Soviet Union and China. And back then, methodologically, the field of China studies was head and shoulders better than the China field. They'd been at it 2 decades longer. And that's where we went for insight and ideas on how to tackle China. But a difference was in the Soviet studies field, most people didn't like one another. Most of those who taught in the field were emigre white Russians or East Europeans. The white Russians hated the Soviet Union because it was communist. The Central Europeans hated it because it was Russian and communist. And that spilled over, attitudinally, and the field had developed long enough to have factions that fought with one another. The China field was very different. That our introduction was mainly through the kids of missionaries, kids of business people who had grown up in China, didn't particularly like communism, but they loved China, had an affection for China. And as importantly, for purposes of this talk, we understood that if we're really going to make progress in understanding this big place we call China, both collectively and individually, we really would do a lot better to work together. And mechanisms to facilitate collaborative work began to be developed. Before talking about some of those mechanisms, I want to underscore that China studies was not an esoteric outlier in this period. It was integral to the development of disciplinary approaches. It was central to the area studies. Indeed, it was one of the 2 best funded, most centers, know your enemy logic approaches that trained a lot of people. They created critical masses in lots of institutions, in lots of parts of the country, who could and were prompted to work together as students and afterwards. So we borrowed from and contributed to larger streams of intellectual development. China studies at the beginning was something anybody can play. That the language requirements were not nearly as important as they are now, because we didn't have access to many Chinese language materials. Ones that we did have access to, as Alice Miller pointed out in her talk, were translated, abundantly translated. And the translations were widely disseminated, made available to people, not just in government, but also outside of government. So from anywhere in the country, you could work on translations of all of the primary Chinese periodicals, key Chinese government released documents. So you didn't need to have the language study. You didn't have to have a deep knowledge of the history, because nobody had quite figured out how important history was to contemporary China. This rich marketplace for ideas was shaped, and repeat a point I made earlier, by the convergence of academic interests and government interests. Until 1979 or so, academic research on China was research at a distance. That a few people made short trips, but to qualify them as research visits to China is an exaggeration. But with the influence that came out of the Office of Strategic Services, World War II institution, populated mainly by academics who spent the war working in Washington in a building on Navy Hill, kind of across the street from the State Department. What is now the State Department was the War Department back then. Learned to ask policy relevant questions. They asked big questions. What's the relative importance of communist ideology and Chinese nationalism? What's the institutional structure of this new country called the People's Republic of China? How do officials in this new country view the challenges in their own country, view the region, view the world? What are their goals? What are their priorities? What are the policies that they're adopting to pursue these goals? How do they reflect the perspective of different bureaucratic elements, people with different histories in the military? That was one of the frameworks used at the time, field armies as the basis for political factions in China. What were the principal drivers and shaping factors for Chinese policy and Chinese behavior? Could we identify them? Once we'd identified them, or thought we had, do we discern any patterns? Did we see trajectories where events or policies or whatever we were looking at move along a discernible trajectory, an evolutionary path? And if we thought there were patterns and we thought that we discerned a trajectory, what are the factors that kept events on that trajectory, that maintained policy continuity, because recurring consideration and decisions in conjunction with 5-year plans and government work reports and the like reflected the same prioritization of criteria for what China did or should do, reflected the same or changing influence, power of different viewpoints within the leadership. Were the viewpoints sifting, or are they a part of a permanent or enduring faction, an alignment, a winning coalition? How did we think about that? But what kept developments on a trajectory, and what might deflect or derail that trajectory? If Mao got hit by a bus, would China change? How would it change? As we got into the Cultural Revolution and the Chinese offered very emphatic descriptions of who was an enemy, who was a friend, who was a capitalist roader, why developments. How much of that explanation was credible? How much of it was a different way of talking about a more common political phenomenon, coalition formation and reformation, the impact of individuals' agency within a system? We were building a store of basic knowledge about a lot of countries. We the social science disciplines at the time, including China. When you know almost nothing every increment of knowledge is a big deal, even if they don't fit together so clearly at the beginning. But we tackle subjects in part in the order at which it became desirable or feasible to look at them. Desire was driven by questions coming out of the policy arena, was driven by what foundations would fund, was driven by conferences and workshops and book projects organized by the Joint Committee on Contemporary China, was driven by disciplinary advances or fads, however you want to think about them, that produced knowledge about China. So much of what is conventional wisdom today was largely unknown in the 1960s. It had to be discovered. It had to be invented. It had to be refined. It had to be conveyed to folks in government, in the think tank world, and in the classroom. It's useful to revisit, but unnecessary to reinvent, in my opinion, kind of this baseline knowledge from the period. We did it in part for government audiences because of patriotism in the Cold War. We did it in part because government officials were interested. And we did it in part because there simply were very, very few people with China expertise inside the federal government at the time. I'll come back to that. But first on the building blocks of information and knowledge. There are questions we could ask now that are offshoots, derivatives, reincarnations of questions that we asked decades ago. How has ideology changed? Have its importance and uses in China changed? What caused that change? Modernization, economic development, personality change at the top of the system, going down different roads after the break with Moscow, use of ideology as justification, as a fig leaf for doing things that really are motivated by a capitalist economic logic, by determination to maintain control, lest China revert to being Sun Yat-sen's sheet of loose sand, lest there be demonstrations with a particular social complaint that might morph into an attack on the system as a whole. Are legacy institutions an impediment or an asset to China today? What's the cumulative effect of continual tweaking or reform of institutions adopted and adapted from the Soviet Union in the 1950s? China has been enormously adept at repurposing, revamping 19th century institutions to facilitate miracle economic growth in the 21st century. Can they do that forever? Will it run out of gas? Is there a natural limit to what is possible? What would you look for to determine whether it's in danger of tipping over or can continue indefinitely? These are variants of the kind of questions we were asking a long time ago. What are the key strengths and vulnerabilities in China's system? let me move to some additional shaping factors. One is the know your enemy aspirations of Cold War fears and objectives. That even though my generation, the first large generation of China specialists, were very much influenced by the Vietnam War and specifically the anti-war movement. I was a founding member of the Committee of Concerned Asian Scholars. That we viewed scholarship not as ivory tower isolated from the real world kinds of scholarship, but as a tool, an instrument, a weapon to influence government policy and decision making. We hoped for the better. Every generation hopes that their contributions will make the world a better place. We certainly were motivated by that objective. The legacy of McCarthyism. Because of the 1950s attacks on the people who lost China, the Johns, the 5 Johns that lost China, the discrediting of area studies, China-specific expertise, people in the government and outside, academics were attacked in this as well. That not very many people entered the emerging field of China studies in the late 1950s or early 1960s. And if you were an ambitious and aspiring foreign service officer or official, intelligence official, defense specialist in the national security apparatus, becoming a China specialist was not a career-making move. So people didn't go into it. People began to go into the field outside of government. And indeed, I have always thought that one, perhaps the primary reason that Morta Bramowitz, a China specialist at the State Department, reached out to recruit me to head the China division in 1985 was because of the paucity of people who had what was judged to be the requisite level of experience. I'd been working on China for 20 years at that point. There were very, very few people who were not in the upper ranks of the Foreign Service who had that kind of experience. And the ones in the upper ranks were some excellent ones, like Stape Roy, Bill Gleistein, that they were too senior for the job that I eventually took. But the paucity of expertise inside the government created a need for tapping the expertise of people outside. And it meant if you were an outside expert, you had a real opportunity to make an impact because what you were selling had a real market. You were a necessary colleague in this joint effort to understand China, and the purpose for understanding China was to not get into military conflict with China, or to understand the possibilities and limits of Chinese influence in the region. That situation has changed dramatically. There are lots of China specialists inside the government. A lot of them are very good in there. And they don't need the outside expertise, except as a training area and a bullpen that can be called upon for people with particular expertise to fill in. And that's just a very, very different aspect of it. We were all shaped by the interest and insights of generations that went before. And by generations here, I'm not in birth cohorts, but sort of the phases of development of the field. But the the first one that's relevant here are the missionary kids in China hands. Lucian Pye, Doak Barnett, Ed Clubb, John Fairbank. That people who had extensive experience in China and probably less disciplinary training unless it was in history going into it. But these were people who trained the very first generation of non-China brat kids. There's the World War II and Korea veterans, a lot of whom had learned how to read characters by being Japanese language officers during the Second World War. People like Chow Johnson, Lyman Van Slyke, Franz Sherman, that the introduction to Asia was through Japan, and the key to becoming a China specialist was the ability to handle characters. The first wave of area studies students, and not very large, Rick Baum, Fred Tevis, Tom Bernstein, Dick Solomon. There are others, but not a large number of others. We don't get a lot of people. We don't get critical masses spread across multiple disciplines until I'll call it the Vietnam War generation. That it went from single-digit China specialist or aspiring China specialist in sociology, history, political science, economics to 3, 4, 5 people per class, creating a much greater critical mass of people able to work together, to do complementary work, to challenge one another, and beginning to get better language capabilities than those who went before. But there was also more collaboration and coordination because of structures. Most of these have eroded. I mentioned the NDEA centers, area studies centers, that created a place to come together for lunch, come together for brown bag seminars, come together for fellowship applications. I mentioned the Joint Committee on Contemporary China. This is the joint committee of the American Council of Learned Societies and the Social Science Research Council that pooled its resources in ways that were designed to build the field of contemporary China. So it organized events. It created fellowship opportunities. It supported book projects. Most of these early books were edited volumes. Most of the contributors to the edited volumes were new graduate students, recent PhDs, working with preliminary work that could be published in a respectable volume, to be critiqued, to be cited by others. So begin to build a reputation and begin to learn from the errors in these preliminary works. It's now very, very difficult to find a university press willing to publish edited volumes, certainly edited volumes with chapters by no-name scholars. And that is a huge impediment to pushing the field forward, in my view. I mentioned the minimal competition for jobs, for tenure, for publication. The market, broadly define academe, think tank, government, had an enormous appetite for information on China, particularly when the information was at the level of China, not a piece of China, not a subset of China, but of China. And some was better than others as we fumbled towards understanding. And as China began to open up, as we began to take our research cues from what seemed to be important to Beijing, what were Beijing's priorities under the reform and opening drive? What were the consequences of changing the order of the four modernizations, moving science and technology toward the front of that? As China began to produce oil, there were silly things written about China as the next Saudi Arabia, but dependence on oil to support economic development made energy an important subject to study. Energy takes water, and that has an impact on agriculture. So we found different roads into understanding large questions about China, because non-sensitive areas, or areas in which they were quite happy to demonstrate what they were working on, worried about, tap expertise, and the field followed that. Finally, we constantly reminded ourselves of how much we didn't know. That, like every other scholarly generation, we were arrogant about what we did know and what we knew that those who went before had not yet discovered. But there really was a rather remarkable willingness to ask questions that might, in other settings, other circumstances, have been embarrassing. You really don't know the structure of the Ministry of Light Industry, or you didn't know that that university was within the aerospace Shitung system. And I remember one of my you really don't know questions. Before I went to the State Department, I was going to do a book that would parallel John Lewis and Xue Litai's China Builds the Bomb. My parallel one was going to be what China was doing in the civilian science sector in parallel, that supported the nuclear program but was separate. And I ran across an institute that was in Tianjin. And I couldn't figure out why it was in Tianjin. Why wasn't it in Beijing, where everything else was? And I happened to have a princeling, or a princess, I guess would be the right, who I knew, and I asked the question. I was a kind of an innocent, almost obvious question. She looked at me and says, "You don't know?" I said, "No, I don't know. That's why I'm asking the question." She says, "You really don't know why that's in Tianjin?" I said, "No, I don't." And said, "That's headed by," and I've forgotten the name of the head of the institute. And I said, "Yeah, well, so what? Why has that made it necessary for her to go to Tianjin?" She says, "That's Jiang Qing's first husband. He's so smart, he had to be in charge of this. But because it's Jiang Qing's former spouse, there's no way he could be in Beijing, so there's no way that the institute could be in Beijing." You go, okay, I got it. I asked a question somebody thought was a stupid question, but I learned something about the dynamics of the way China worked at the time. So what are some old lessons for a new era? And I'll wrap this up with this. The field of China studies is much larger and much more diverse, and in many ways very different than it was 50 years ago. Far more people with far better language, far better disciplinary skills, far greater command of the basic building block information that has been accumulated over the decades. There's far more collaborative work with Chinese counterparts. A lot of them are Western trained, same social science methodologies, willing and able to work collaboratively with American partners. And until quite recently, enabled to do so, allowed to do so by Beijing. That's a problem now, as it's become harder for them to collaborate. That what they can work on, and hence what we can work on together, is more restricted. But now we've got fewer people and much less work on what I will call big questions, or have called big questions. We delude ourselves to think these big questions about China is just the impact of history, the impact of ideology, the impact of organizational structure, the impact of generations, the impact of the termination of the extended family because of one child per couple. We think the big questions have been answered, and they haven't been, in my judgment. There's more work to be done. But for the last 40 years, it's been possible to research on narrower and smaller questions and to be rewarded for doing so. Indeed, easier to get money to do research on smaller questions than on big questions. Necessary to work on smaller, carve out an esoteric niche questions than on big ones in order to meet disciplinary expectations. Less collaborative work because of competition for jobs. Less organization to bring us together for conferences, for workshops, for book projects. There's been a drastic erosion of organizational structure and drive that the earliest pioneers, Oxenberg, Lewis, Sternberger, Barnett, Scalapino, Pai, others like that, put together to build a field. We're not building a field anymore. We have a field, or as my friend, classmate Harry Harding points out, we have a collection of microscopic subfields that the China field has fractured into subspecialties that don't regularly talk to one another, inform one another. And that's a real loss, in my judgment. We've got greater tension now between what's necessary to revitalize the field and what's demanded by departments, academic departments, and what's demanded by the US government. To overstate it, the US government is still interested in big questions, is still willing to go to the academic arena, but for answers to rather specific questions instead of broad understanding and insight. Departments, and I'll overstate it, the narrower the better. The more esoteric, the better. Quest for big N, quantitative analyses that facilitate greater insight into small questions, that don't easily aggregate and don't throw a great deal of light on system level developments and prospects. So I think a part of the dusting off of the lost arts and refurbishing lost tools needs to be putting the Humpty Dumpty field of China studies back together again. We need to become a field and not a collection of feudal satrapies, subfields, narrow specialties, concern more with finding or keeping a position than with advancing our collective understanding of this still incredibly interesting and obviously important place. Let me stop there and invite your questions. And thanks again to SAIS for this opportunity to take you back to memory lane. Andy?
Thanks so much, Tom. I have a couple questions as the Q&A and chat functions start to populate. And one of them has to do with this. It seems to me that you are talking, what's really driving a lot of this, or one way to think about all of this, is the kinds of incentive structures that exist both within academia and within government and other fellow traveling institutions. And there seems to be a convergence, and now they've become, as you say, so big and so, I mean, particularly academia, so fragmented as well, that it's hard for me to imagine, for example, what does a field look like, because this is all I've known.
Right.
And if I, and I imagine I'm not the only person. And so I'm wondering what, I'm thinking of Potter Stewart. I know it when I see it. What might some ways of identifying that we would be going in the right direction be in your mind, and in your what I think is a very accurate read of where we find ourselves today.
Well, there's no magic bullet solution, but elements I think that are necessary, may not be sufficient, are activists. That a small number of people who see this as almost a mission, that rebuilding the field of China studies is what I'm determined to achieve over the next decade. It'll probably take that long. That means you can get advice from the graybeards, but you can't build a field around 75-year-olds. So it's going to have to be people who have passed the tenure hurdle, are secure in their academic standing, that have the capacity to continue doing research because they love to do research, but are willing to dedicate the time and the effort to organizational issues. Read Mao, get organized, and find some signals and advice in that. A part of it, I think, has to be making the case to foundations that while it's all well and good to fund scattershot, fad du jour kind of topics, that what we really do need is another integrated approach that identifies some building blocks, that trains people with those skills, that creates opportunities for those already working on them. And something like the old Joint Committee, JCCC, and something like the Mike Oxenberg, great chess master, attempting to move young scholars around on the field. That some of us were more resentful of his efforts than others, but it creates opportunities. It identifies gaps that can usefully be filled. And the final point on it is, I think things like the Public Intellectuals Program that you were a part of, that learning to talk to policy, learning to be useful. It's not write policy recommendations. It's think hard about the results of your research, whatever the topic is, even if it is fairly. And so after you said, how do I get this published? How does this help me get promoted? Say, what are the insights that I have from my research that might be helpful to policy guys, to an assistant secretary for East Asia, for head of the China desk, to deal with his or her problems? Being useful, making the academic research accessible, and publishing it in an esteemed journal is not to make it accessible. It's to write the op-eds. It's to send papers to staffers on the Hill, staffers who are working for members who you know are interested in some dimension of either China or the subject of specialized research. So you get on the list of usual suspects. And that way you learn what the policy guys are concerned about and interested in. And it's not you have to do that kind of research, but if you know about it and it's interesting to you, and either you're looking for the next project or you've got a grad student looking for the next paper topic, you've got a way of connecting. And that becomes additive and cumulative. But it goes back to the, who's the Mike Oxenberg? Who's the John Lewis that will drive this train?
That's a great way to think about it, and to strategize, and to keep eyes open for who that person or those people might be. I have a question that I'll paraphrase it a little bit. It's a larger question, that the purpose of you said something along the lines of the purpose of studying China or researching was to avoid war with China, and so the logic there is the more you know, the better prepared you are to find a way through whatever tensions might arise, or to essentially navigate the ship of state in a way that that reduces tensions, et cetera, et cetera. And I just, based on that, I'd love to get your comment. Says the questioner, about given that today it seems like there's so many opportunities that are being closed off, not only in China, but also in terms of opportunities here in the United States, but also funding opportunities in others, but also the language, the narrative, the dominant narrative is pointing to a kind of a caricature of China that almost seems to offer the exact opposite motivation. And so would you comment on that?
Yeah, one of the things that is distressing is the number of China specialists who have jumped on the bandwagon of the narrative that engagement was a naive and foolish and dangerous mistake. That China is an existential threat, an enemy, for essentialist reasons. So why is it? It's because it's China. It's because it's a rising country. That it's because it has an authoritarian system. As if putting a label on China is adequate to get at what makes this place tick. I don't believe the relationship is in nearly as bad a shape as the contemporary narrative maintains. And being old enough to remember the post-Sputnik use of the Soviet Union in order to justify expending money on programs that were expensive, contentious, and complex that we'd not done because it was too hard to do it. Now you got to do it because the Soviets are doing it. Now China provides that justification. And a China threat makes it possible to put programs, activities into the national security bucket. Who's going to vote against things to maintain national security? So if that's where you have to put funding for pre-kindergarten and free daycare, okay, I don't have a problem with doing that. But we ought not, certainly the China specialists, the China studies field, ought not simply acquiesce to that. I sure as hell don't want to come across as China's lawyer. There's lots about China that I find distressing to deplorable. But I don't believe that they are hell-bent on destroying the United States, the international system, the rules-based order. This is a fragile place that acts like it's fearful, not like it's confident. And it seems to me it's up to the China studies field to make the case that we can work with China. That the dilemma, those of us have been kind of working a relationship for decades, and I started with ping pong in 1972, that we don't want to have an in-the-face approach to China that causes them problems in responding and doing things with us, but by downplaying the expected benefits to us, we fail to build domestic understanding and constituencies for the policies that, in my judgment, are working quite well with respect to China. Not perfectly, and it's gotten harder in the last decade to do almost everything. But when it gets hard, it's not the time to give up. I remember I started before the Cultural Revolution, and when the Cultural Revolution was unleashed, how are we going to understand this place? How are we going to work with this place? During the Vietnam War and keeping the Chinese out of that war, we didn't want another Korea experience, suddenly looked a lot harder, and therefore made it more necessary to do what we could to get into the heads of the Chinese and to help people making decisions in our own country to ask the right questions and explore alternatives to the simple-minded, they're bad because they're bad.
So we've got time for one or two let me I guess one this is more of a policy question, but I think it's also indirectly related to the incentives that that people in the academy may or may not have in terms of their own research agendas. So the question, I'll just read the question. You've often advocated for a policy of strategic cooperation with China. Given the state of U.S.-China relations, what areas do you think the U.S. is able to engage China in at present day? Trade is a sensitive issue now, even the education sector, public health as well. You'd mentioned energy, and by extension, or we've seen what's been going on with climate. I guess I'll just add my own thoughts to this question, which was, it seemed to me a year and a half or 2 years ago that one area where the two countries could cooperate fairly easily was on coordinated responses to pandemics. And boy, did I turn out to be wrong on that. And so anyway, I'll hand the mic over to you.
Yeah, well, the short, but I do not mean it to be flippant, answer is there's an enormous array of issues that we might be able to cooperate, that we should attempt to cooperate for all kinds of reasons, not the least of which is it's 1/7 of the intellectual horsepower in the world. That to not try and tap that, or for them not to try and tap us, is an enormously heavy anchor on trying to deal with energy problems, climate problems, rising sea level problems, food, nutrition problems, water availability problems, the absence of rules in space, the absence of rules in cyberspace, the absence of rules governing most international financial transactions, and so forth. There was lots of institution building and problem solving work to be done. I think the problem isn't the lack of candidate issues. It is a combination of a difference in approach where, to overstate it, Americans are quite prepared to deal a problem at a time in isolation, de-link. That if you can work on something, or you need to work on something, or you can't mitigate a serious problem without cooperation, you take that on. There's not a natural hierarchy of move from education because it's easy to energy because it's a little harder to health. That any of them could be easy if there's the will to do it. But we're willing to start without preconditions. The Chinese pretty consistent position was first you establish trust. Once there is trust, then you've met the precondition for collaboration on specific issues. I think this recent Biden-Xi meeting, and kind of that, looking at it from way out here in California, I think the Chinese may be relaxing that precondition. They need the relationship to do more things than we need that relationship to do. So I think we ought to try wherever there is. The second factor that we need to overcome is a correlate of using China to justify fixing our infrastructure, rebuilding our military after 20 years of war. That if we didn't have China, how would we justify $1 trillion defense budget? And that's the idea that you shouldn't reward China. You shouldn't overlook that they haven't been completely transparent about the coronavirus in there. We shouldn't hobble ourselves in doing this. If there's a chance to work together and to solve or ameliorate a serious problem that we want to address, you swallow hard and you do it with them.
I mean, I think that's as good a note to end on. It's certainly something that I would, advocate on my end as well. And I just want to, unfortunately, because of the online nature of this of this exchange, we can't hear all the hands clapping. But I do want to just thank you again, Tom, for taking the time out. This context, I think, was really, really important. I learned a lot of things that I thought I had known, and turns out, as you had mentioned, one knows, one learns what they don't know, and one can be humble about it and accept it, which I choose to do, and I think we all benefit from doing so. So I really, really appreciate this, and very much looking forward to continuing this conversation and others. But I think you've really done the audience, future audience, current audience members, but also future ones online, a huge service in terms of helping them navigate and find a way forward. So thanks again.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak in this program, which is a terrific approach to rebuilding our discipline in our field.
One step at a time. Ibu,
One step at a time.
Take care, Tom, and we'll talk soon.
Goodbye, Andy. And goodbye,
Bye-bye.
all.